January 17th, 1945. Fort McCoy, Wisconsin. The cold cut through their thin coats like broken glass. Snow clung to the barbed wire fences, turning them into white, jagged lines against the gray morning sky. The German women stepped off the transport trucks, their breath rising in short, visible bursts, their eyes searching for threats they had been promised would come. They had crossed an ocean expecting cruelty, starvation, perhaps worse. Instead, the first thing that hit them was a smell, warm, buttery, impossibly rich, drifting from a building ahead. One woman whispered to another, "What is that?" No one answered because no one knew. They had been taught that enemies do not feed prisoners. They had been warned that Americans showed no mercy. But the smell told a different story, one that would shatter everything they believed about war, about kindness, about the nation that had captured them. If this story moves you, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel. These true World War II stories deserve to be remembered, and your support helps us keep them alive for future generations. The women shuffled forward in a loose line, their boots crunching through fresh snow. Some had been radio operators in North Africa. Others had worked in field hospitals or clerical offices attached to German units. None of them were combat soldiers, but all of them had lived under a system that drilled one lesson into their minds over and over. The enemy will break you. The enemy will starve you. The enemy will strip you of your humanity. That message had been repeated so many times it became instinct. Now, standing in the frozen stillness of Wisconsin, that instinct felt uncertain. The guards did not shout. The trucks did not rush. Even the camp itself looked strangely orderly, almost peaceful. Smoke rose gently from chimneys. Paths had been shoveled clean. Buildings stood sturdy and intact, untouched by bombs or fire. For women who had spent their final months in Europe, dodging air raids and rationing every crumb, this place felt like a hallucination. And then they realized something even more shocking. The warmth, the food, the order, it was all real, and it was meant for them. The journey to this moment had been long and disorienting. Most of the women had been captured in the chaotic final months of the war, when German supply lines collapsed and entire units found themselves cut off from command. Some surrendered willingly, too exhausted to continue. Others were taken after air raids destroyed their positions. The voyage across the Atlantic had been cramped and anxious, filled with whispered fears about what awaited them on the other side. Rumors spread through the ship's hold like fever. One woman claimed she had heard that American camps worked prisoners to death in frozen fields. Another insisted that food would be withheld as punishment. A third said simply, "We will not survive this." These stories fed on each other, growing darker with each retelling, until by the time they reached American soil, many of the women had resigned themselves to suffering. But Fort McCoy did not match the nightmare they had imagined. The camp sprawled across rolling hills blanketed in snow, surrounded by dense forests that stretched toward the horizon. Guard towers stood at regular intervals, but the men inside them looked bored, not cruel. When the women were led through the gates, no one struck them, no one screamed orders. Instead, they were counted, registered, and directed toward low wooden barracks that smelled faintly of pine and soap. Inside, the rooms were simple but clean. A small heater hummed in the corner, radiating warmth that seemed impossible after so many cold nights in transit. One woman sat on a bunk and touched the blanket as if it might disappear. Another stood near the heater, holding her hands close to the heat, her eyes closed. They had expected punishment. They found comfort, and that comfort terrified them more than cruelty ever could. Because if the Americans were not monsters, then everything they had been told was a lie. The first full day in the camp passed in a blur of confusion. The women were given basic instructions, shown where to wash, told when meals would be served. The rules were simple and delivered without anger. No one was locked in cells. No one was separated for interrogation. Instead, they were treated like people who needed rest, food, and time to recover. This gentleness felt wrong, as if it were a trick designed to lower their guard before the real punishment began. Some women refused to relax. They stayed tense, waiting for the moment when the mask would slip. Others wanted to believe but could not let go of their fear. A few whispered late at night, questioning whether they were being fattened up for something worse. But the next morning the bell rang for breakfast, and everything changed again. The dining hall stood at the center of the camp, a long rectangular building with wide windows and a sloped roof heavy with snow. As the women approached, the smell grew stronger. Bread baking, meat sizzling, something thick and creamy that none of them recognized. Inside, the hall was bright and organized. Long wooden tables ran the length of the room, each one cleaned and ready. American soldiers sat near the front, finishing their breakfast with casual ease, talking and laughing, as if war were a distant memory. The women lingered near the entrance, unsure whether they were allowed to enter. One of the cooks, a young man with flour dusted across his apron, glanced over and waved them forward. "Come on," he said, his voice calm and friendly. "There's plenty." Plenty. That word hit them like a punch. In Germany, plenty had disappeared years ago. By 1944, rations in most cities had dropped below survival levels. Families queued for hours to receive a single loaf of bread. Soup kitchens served watery broth with no meat, no fat, no substance. Children learned to recognize hunger as a constant companion, and adults learned to hide their desperation behind tight smiles. For these women, food had become something to fight for, to hoard, to protect. The idea that there could be plenty, that an enemy nation could offer it freely, felt incomprehensible. Yet here it was. Trays stacked high, steam rising from metal containers, the smell of breakfast filling every corner of the room. They moved forward slowly, still cautious, still expecting someone to stop them. But no one did. Instead, they watched as American cooks scooped scrambled eggs onto plates, ladled oatmeal into bowls, and placed soft white biscuits, covered in thick gravy, onto trays. The biscuits looked nothing like German bread. They were pale, fluffy, almost cake-like in texture. The gravy was even stranger, a creamy white sauce flecked with black pepper and bits of sausage. One woman leaned close to another and whispered, "Is it sweet or salty?" Her friend shook her head. "I have no idea." They had no reference point for this meal. It existed outside their experience, a mystery wrapped in steam and butter. When they finally sat down, the benches creaked beneath them. The hall felt too open, too bright, too safe. They touched the biscuits with their forks, testing the softness. One woman pressed down gently and watched the dough compress, then spring back. Another lifted a piece to her nose and inhaled, trying to guess the flavor. The gravy clung to the biscuit in thick layers, coating it completely. Someone whispered, "Maybe it is meant for later." Another replied, "Or maybe it is a test." No one wanted to take the first bite. But hunger, patient and insistent, finally won. The first woman to taste it closed her eyes. For a moment she said nothing. Then her face changed. Her shoulders dropped. Her grip on the fork loosened. She took another bite, faster this time, and then another. Around her, other women followed. The hall filled with the quiet sounds of eating, forks scraping plates, soft murmurs of surprise, the occasional pause as someone stopped to process what they were tasting. The biscuit was warm and soft, dissolving on the tongue. The gravy was rich and salty, heavy with cream and pepper, and tiny chunks of sausage that added bursts of flavor. For women who had survived on thin soup and stale bread, the richness was almost overwhelming. It settled in their stomachs like a blanket, warm and solid and real. One woman set down her fork and stared at her empty plate. She looked at her hands, then at the plate again, as if trying to understand how the food had disappeared so quickly. Another wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and whispered, "This cannot be real." But it was. The cooks moved steadily behind the counter, refilling containers, wiping down surfaces, preparing for the next group. There was no shortage, no rationing, no punishment for finishing a meal. The American system, built on vast agricultural production and industrial efficiency, had created a surplus so large that even prisoners ate well. In 1944 alone, the United States produced over 1.8 billion barrels of oil, 96,000 aircraft, and enough food to feed its military, its civilians, and millions of prisoners across dozens of camps. Germany, by contrast, struggled to produce 33 million barrels of oil and could barely feed its own soldiers. The women did not know these numbers, but they felt the difference, they tasted it, and it terrified them. Because if America could feed its enemies this well, what did that say about the war? What did that say about the propaganda they had been raised on? What did that say about the system they had served? The meal ended, but the questions remained. The women filed out of the dining hall in silence, their stomachs full, their minds spinning. Some returned to their barracks and lay on their bunks, staring at the ceiling. Others gathered in small groups, whispering in low voices, trying to make sense of what had just happened. One woman, a former nurse who had worked in a field hospital outside Berlin, finally said what many were thinking. "They are not supposed to be kind. We were told they would hate us." Her friend, a radio operator from Hamburg, replied quietly, "Maybe we were told many things that were not true." That realization spread slowly through the group like a crack in ice. The women began to question other stories they had been told. If the Americans were not cruel, were they also not weak? If they had this much food, did they also have more weapons, more planes, more soldiers than Germany could ever match? The answers came not from speeches or lectures, but from observation. Over the following days, the women noticed patterns. Trucks arrived on time. Supplies were unloaded with mechanical efficiency. Guards rotated shifts without confusion. The camp operated like a machine, smooth and relentless, powered by systems the women had never seen in their own military. One afternoon, a guard left a newspaper on a bench. One of the women picked it up and began to read. The articles criticized the government openly, questioned military decisions, debated policy changes. She stared at the page in disbelief. In Germany, such writing would have led to arrest or worse. Here, it was ordinary. Another woman noticed American women walking past the camp's outer fence, carrying groceries, laughing with friends, moving freely, without fear. Their clothing was simple but clean. Their faces showed no signs of starvation or desperation. The contrast was stark. Back home, women queued for hours in bombed streets, rationed every pfennig, and lived under constant surveillance. Here, life continued as if the war were something distant and manageable. The women began to understand that the kindness they received was not a trick. It was a reflection of a different worldview, one built on abundance rather than scarcity, on systems rather than fear. The meals continued, steady and predictable. Biscuits and gravy became a recurring comfort, a symbol of the strange new reality they inhabited. Some women asked for seconds, hesitant at first, then more confident when the cooks simply nodded and served another portion. No punishment came. No one was scolded. The generosity felt endless. But the emotional weight of that generosity was almost unbearable, because every meal reminded them of what their families back home were enduring. Every warm biscuit reminded them of the cold, the hunger, the desperation they had left behind. Guilt settled over the camp like fog. Some women stopped eating as much, as if refusing food could somehow make things fairer. Others ate quickly, afraid the kindness would end. A few cried quietly at night, torn between gratitude and shame. Then came the announcement that changed everything. Germany had surrendered. The war was over. The women gathered in the yard, stunned and silent. An American officer stood before them and explained calmly that they would be sent home. No punishment, no revenge, just transport back to Europe as soon as arrangements could be made. The women did not cheer. They did not celebrate. They simply stood there, trying to absorb the magnitude of what had just been said. The enemy they had feared, the nation they had been taught to hate, was sending them home safely. And in that moment, many of them realized the most shocking truth of all. They had been lied to about America, about the war, about everything. The days before departure were filled with quiet reflection. The women packed their few belongings, wrote letters to families, and tried to imagine what awaited them across the ocean. Some feared returning to a destroyed homeland. Others hoped desperately that their loved ones had survived. But all of them carried something new, a memory of kindness that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The morning they left, the camp was wrapped in mist. The trucks rolled up, engines rumbling softly. The women climbed aboard without chains, without guards shouting orders, without violence. As the convoy pulled away, many looked back at the camp one last time. They saw the barracks where they had slept safely, the dining hall where they had eaten warm meals, the fence that had kept them in, but had also kept cruelty out. The journey to the port was long and quiet. The women stared out at the American countryside, at farms stretching toward the horizon, at towns untouched by bombs, at children playing in schoolyards. They saw a nation that had fought a global war without collapsing, without starving, without losing its humanity. The sight was humbling and painful, because it made clear what they had refused to see before. Germany had not lost because of cowardice or betrayal. Germany had lost because it had been outmatched in every measurable way, by industry, by resources, by a system that valued efficiency and human dignity over propaganda and fear. Some of them paused at the gangway, turning back for one last look at the ship that had carried them not as cargo, but as human beings. On deck, a young American sailor lifted his hand in an awkward farewell, unsure whether such a gesture was permitted between former enemies. One of the women, Marta, who had once sworn never to look an Allied soldier in the eye, surprised herself by waving back. It was a small movement, almost invisible, yet it felt like the closing of a chapter written in fear. As the ship's engines slowed and the ropes were thrown, the women felt an unexpected ache. This floating world of order and calm had become a fragile bridge between who they had been and who they might become. At night during the voyage, many had lain awake, listening to the low hum of the engines, thinking of daughters left behind, husbands lost at the front, and homes that might no longer exist. Yet even those thoughts had softened, wrapped in the strange security of regular meals and gentle voices. As trains carried them inland, past fields scarred by shell craters and towns reduced to gray skeletons, they spoke quietly among themselves. What would they say about America? Would anyone believe them if they described libraries in a prison camp, doctors who listened, guards who did not strike? Some feared being called traitors. Others feared silence more. They understood now that truth, like mercy, demanded courage. In ruined stations, civilians stared at them with hollow eyes. These women wore no chains, yet they carried invisible ones' memories of indoctrination breaking apart. They realized how deeply they had been taught to hate, and how easily that hatred had dissolved when faced with simple decency. This realization unsettled them more than captivity ever had. In the months that followed, they would stand in ration lines, rebuild shattered homes, and search for names on lists of the missing. Yet on mornings when hunger gnawed and bitterness threatened to return, they would remember the steady rhythm of the ocean crossing, the unexpected kindness of strangers, and the unsettling truth that humanity could survive even where hatred had once ruled. Years later, some would tell their children about the war, but hesitate at this part of the story. How do you explain that your enemy fed you, protected you, and treated you better than your own system ever had? Still, in quiet moments, the memory returned clearly. Biscuits and gravy shared without cruelty, warmth offered without demand. They had arrived as prisoners. They returned as witnesses, and that knowledge stayed with them for the rest of their lives.